Imagine you're a baker in the 18th century and your main ingredient is almost impossible to get. What are you going to do? You're going to substitute. That's what we're talking about today. Thanks for joining us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Bread was the most important food component of the everyday man's diet in the 18th century. Most everyday laborers in the 18th century, they survived on nothing but beer and bread. And they generally didn't bake that bread for themselves. They went to the baker to get that bread. They survived upon it. It was so important to the diet in England that bread was regulated for hundreds of years. Before the 18th century, bread was regulated in its price, in its weight. All the price of the loaf all had to do with the price of wheat in the time period. That's one of the problems. Everyone in that time period was demanding white wheaten bread. That's what they really wanted. They didn't want dark household loaves, the inexpensive bread. Everyone wanted to eat white wheaten bread. What happens though when you have crop failures in the 18th century or before? They had numerous crop failures, the 1630s, the 1690s, the 1740s, and the 1790s. Over and over, they would have weather problems. They would have very, very cold summers. The whole wheat crop would fail, or you would lose, say, 80% of it. And so the rich people, they could still get their white bread. They could afford to buy expensive bread, maybe even from wheat that was imported from the continent or even from North America in that time period. So the common man, he needed something else. The baker had to be able to make some other bread for this common man to eat. And we have wonderful, numerous sources that we can rely on to see just what that baker was doing to feed that everyday man. In 1804, this little amazing book comes out. It's called The Treatise on the Art of Bread Making. And the author is responding to this idea of what are we going to do to feed the common man? Because bread is so important. So he covers the whole art of the baker. And he spends an entire chapter on these substitute items that we need for wheat, because wheat is very hard to get. Even in the time period, 1804, wheat was still very expensive and still in great demand in that time period. So the baker has to come up with a solution. So some of the ingredients that he mentions as substitutes, making bread with peas or partially made with peas doesn't make a very good bread. Sometimes we'll use something like oats or oatmeal that's all ground up, definitely used in bread. We use that today. He talks about maize, or as we call it in North America, corn. That is one of those things that he talks about, but it never really gets popular in Great Britain. Of course, it's been used in North America all these hundreds of years. We make lots of bread from corn and something like barley. We also have buckwheat and a lot of things that are grain-like that are being used. But some things aren't like grains at all being used in this bread. And he mentions potatoes specifically. And in other works, something very, very similar as turnips being used in our bread. Now, we can't necessarily make bread completely from potatoes, but we can use that as an additive to stretch the amount of wheat that you're going to be using in your loaf. So today we'll be doing a recipe right out of the Treatise on the Art of Bread Making. We'll be using potatoes. Let's get started. So this Treatise on the Art of Bread Making, a wonderful book, not only does it have one potato bread recipe in it, but it has 3 potato bread recipes in it, and he spends a great deal of time talking about how to prepare these potatoes for this bread. Now, we're going to use the simplest of the 3 because it gets complex and I don't think it really needs to. To make potato bread, pare 1 peck of potatoes, put them into a proper quantity of water and boil them till they are reduced to a pulp, and then beat them up fine in the water they're boiled in, and knead them with 2 pecks of wheat flour with a sufficient quantity of yeast and salt into a dough. Cover it up. Allow it to ferment for 2 hours or upwards according to the state of your weather, and then make it up into loaves and bake them. Pretty simple recipe, as simple as it is basically the straight bread recipe of the 18th century, which is just wheat flour and yeast and salt and water, and then we add in this potato mash, basically mashed potatoes, in a ratio of 1 part potatoes to 2 parts flour. So we're stretching that out. We're getting as much bread as we can from the wheat flour we've got. So maybe one of the reasons why the author of this book stressed potatoes as much as he did is because the potatoes used in this bread continue to make a very white wheaten loaf. In fact, you might not be able to tell a difference. Maybe he could get away with making bread with potatoes, and his customers might not even know the difference. If he's using some of these other grains, you can tell immediately by the color of the loaf, by the smell of the loaf, or even by the look of the crumb that, hey, this is substitute bread, this isn't what I wanted. And he might even get in trouble from the authorities because bread was regulated. But these potatoes, they make an almost perfectly white loaf, just like a regular white wheat loaf. So the recipe talked about boiling these to a pulp, and sometimes we can interpret that these 18th century recipes as sort of overboiling the food. I don't know if they necessarily did that or it was just how they described it. One of the problems we have with these potatoes is we can overwork them. We can, trying to get them down to that very fine consistency, we can get them to a gloop that we don't want. And so some of these recipes talk about forcing the potatoes through a sieve, just like this one, which is very similar to an 18th century design. And it turns out that if we do that, if we send that through the sieve, it does almost exactly the same thing as a modern day potato ricer. So they were doing basically the same operation. So they would just squish this right through the sieve, squishes it down through that, and gives it just the right consistency without us having to overwork these potatoes. So I kind of peeled these off of the bottom of the sieve, and they're in the perfect consistency at this point. Now the recipe calls for mixing up all these ingredients. We've got our main component of flour here. Again, we need 2 parts of flour to our 1 part of potatoes. We've got a little bit of salt, and we're gonna use some water. And here's our main active ingredient. It's our yeast. Today we'll use, just active yeast. We're getting a little packet from the store, so just follow the directions like that. This, we're kind of using it as they would have done in the 18th century, a barm or a yeast that you get from the brewer. And it's a liquid yeast. It's a yeast that is a byproduct of making beer. And or making ale sometimes. Ale's probably a little bit better. It won't have the bitter hops in it, or at least as much as a standard beer. But that's what we're going to be using for our yeast today. You can use just regular bread yeast from the store. So the water and the flour, those are the things you're going to adjust to get to that nice soft loaf consistency that you're shooting for. If that ball of dough is too hard, it just cannot grow, and you'll have this dense loaf that doesn't do what you want it to do. And then of course, if it's too soft, it just sags, and you have this giant flat loaf, which is still good bread and is totally worth eating. It just isn't as beautiful and isn't quite as easy to use. So our consistency feels really good, but obviously not too hard, not too soft. Looks good. So we can set it in our bowl, kind of bring that around all to the bottom, and then set that in so that it can grow. There we go. So this bowl is still nice and warm. We're gonna let it set for about that 2 hours. I mean, he says in the recipe, it all has to do about the weather, right? They didn't have as much climate control as we do, so they had to adjust their rise time to their weather, but 2 hours should work great for this. We're just gonna cover this up and set it aside. Now we have to work on our oven, getting it up to temperature so we can bake this bread. The fire is looking good in this oven. It's got to heat up for an hour or two, just about the perfect time. When this is up to heat, the bread should be ready. You know, this oven we made, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years ago on the channel, but this oven is a long way away from our homestead set where we're gonna be doing a lot of cooking. So we're gonna be building a new earthen oven, a bigger earthen oven right beside the cabin. So make sure to stay tuned. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you can watch us make this new oven. So 3 things before I try this bread out. I know you want me to try it out right now. That's why I did not wait for the crumb to totally set up on this thing. It might be a little gummy, but I know you want me to try it out now. Number 2, on something like this, use the best butter you can get. I'm telling you, try something like Kerrygold or go to the grocery store and get a specialty butter. It's worth it. And the 3rd thing is we bake this in an earthen oven and it definitely makes a difference. If you get a chance to use an oven like this, do it because it makes the best bread. Let's try this out. It smells so good. It is a nice and tender loaf because it's just come out of the oven. It is still warm. Let's try it. Superb bread. You would never guess that this bread had an additive because you were trying to stretch out the wheat. You know, it's so moist, it's so tender. I can't see how anyone would complain in 1804 or any other time about getting a wonderful potato bread. It is excellent stuff and easy to make. It's so great to be able to do a recipe that connects directly with a situation, an event in history. It isn't just some random recipe out of a cookbook, but it's out of a book that was basically written because of bread shortages. We were able to take one of those recipes and try it out and enjoy it. If you're interested in the treatise on the art of bread making, make sure to check out the link in the description. And if you want other bread making videos, check this out.